¿Qué tal? ¿Cómo están? Buenas noches. Es un placer estar con ustedes en De Cabeza, aquí en ADN 40, su canal. Yo les pregunto, ¿qué tan buena memoria tienen? Por supuesto, con la edad se les ha empeorado. ¿Han tomado algún curso para mejorarla? ¿Les preocupa? ¿Qué es lo que hace que algo, de hecho, sea memorable? ¿Qué tipo de experiencias recuerdan? ¿Se acuerdan cuando dieron su primer beso, si es que lo han dado? ¿El pleito más intenso? Hoy tenemos con nosotros a dos amigos que se han dedicado, que son campeones, alguno de ellos mundial y nacional de memoria, gente que se ha dedicado a escribir libros increíbles. Primero Joshua Foster, que escribió este trabajo que a mí me dejó plasmado y que a raíz de ello, pues me volví un fan de este trabajo que se llama Caminando en la Luna con Einstein. Es un periodista y es un escritor que por su curiosidad entró a estos temas y lo probó por sí mismo, que si te lo propones, todo se puede en este tema de la memoria. Por el otro lado, gracias a él conocí a Chester Santos en Estados Unidos y de hecho me metí un curso de memoria con Chester. Una vez, meses después, me lo encuentro en el aeropuerto. Me dice, oye Andrés, tú pusiste una frase en uno de mis libros para recomendarlo. Yo le dije, discúlpame, pero no me acuerdo de ti. Me dijo, fui tu maestro de memoria, me hubieras reprobado. Señoras y señores, estos son personajes que han dejado una marca para entender el cerebro humano. Bienvenidos, welcome Joshua and Chester to your program Upside Down. How are you? Welcome and thank you for being with us.
It's great to be here.
Great to be here.
Joshua, we will start with you. Share with us a little bit about your story, which is amazing. How everything started. How you became. How did you become interested in this topic, and little bit of the story behind your great book of Einstein. Please share it with us. Welcome.
Sure. Thank you. Well, so, I'm a science journalist by background, and I had been sent, this is now over a decade ago, to go cover a strange contest called the United States Memory Championship. And it was at that contest that I met Chester. He was one of the competitors. And these guys were memorizing all sorts of things, random numbers, poems, entire shuffled packs of playing cards. And Chester and the other competitors all said to me, anybody can do this. This is just a set of tricks, a set of techniques that were invented in ancient Greece 2,500 years ago that used to be known by everybody and have subsequently been forgotten. And we're like the last people on earth who are still experts in training our memories. And my sort of journalist alarm bell started going off, and I said, that's fascinating. And I ended up spending the better part of the next year trying to train my own memory using these ancient techniques, and ended up coming back to that same contest a year later, entered it, ended up winning and becoming the United States Memory Champion.
Wow. And are you writing, are you still involved in this topic? What's your new research, your new challenge? Could you share a little bit with us?
Sure. So I am no longer competing in the world of competitive memorizing, having written Moonwalking with Einstein. My new projects are a company I founded called Atlas Obscura, which is all about documenting the curiosity and wonder of the world. You can find that at atlasobscura.com. And then I'm actually finishing up a book right now about the world's last hunter-gatherers. So I spent the better part of 4.5 years going back and forth to the Republic of Congo to hang out with a very, very different subculture than the competitive memorizers, to find out how the last people on Earth who are still hunting and gathering live and think about the world.
By the way, I want to share with you that we had your co-author of Atlas Obscura, and I'm a big fan of those books. And
Thank you.
Well, we miss you at Las Ideas, but it's also an amazing work what you have done there. Les recomiendo mucho el trabajo también de Joshua, Atlas Obscura. Es uno de los libros más fascinantes que pueden encontrar. Chester, again, a pleasure to see you. Please share with us your story, which is also fascinating.
Great to see you as well. Thank you for having me. So after Joshua kicked my butt in the U.S. Memory Championship in 2006, I ended up winning it a couple of years later in 2008. And since then, I've spent the last 12 plus years training other people around the world in how they can learn these techniques and use them to develop memory skills that will benefit them in their career, personal life, and also to help their kids out in school. Oh.
Joshua, back with you.
This is the joys of Zoom.
Chester, you forgot how Zoom works. Questions about the brain. I mean, I was reading the book of Sachter. I don't know if you have read this book about the scenes of memory. If we could talk a little bit about memory and then we could talk about techniques. I don't know if you have been involved that, for example, Sachter from Harvard, in his book that talks about 7 scenes about memory, he mentions that some of the faults and problems of the memory is that you remember things that never happened. Actually, you're creating, you're lying, but you strongly believe that you have living these kind of things. And that's one of the passive ways of talking about memory. And the active is the typical that I forgot where I left my keys. And it has to do with different parts of the brain. And I don't know if also there are techniques to mitigate that kind of problems. I don't know, Joshua, Chester, if we could talk a little bit about, first of all, what's actually memorable? Why we remember some things and not other things? And second, what are the traps or the scenes that are going on? And then to talk a little bit about techniques that you could share with the audience. Joshua, if you would like to share with us.
I mean, I would say many of the sins that Schachter talks about in that book are really biases of our memory. In the same way that Kahneman and others have written about our mental biases, our memories have lots of biases. And there are certain kinds of information that we're better at remembering, certain kinds of information that we're worse at remembering. And we all know this from our everyday lives. If you walk around a house and you walk out of that house, you'll probably remember where all the rooms were. We would never regard that as a feat of memory, but that's actually a lot of data that your brain just eats up. We're terrible at remembering phone numbers. We're terrible at remembering word for word instructions from our spouses, at least in my case. And what the memory champions are doing is taking information that is not very memorable and transforming it into the kinds of memories that our brains really love to remember. And so taking advantage of effectively hacking those biases of how our memory works. Chester could probably talk a little bit about how he does that when he competes in these memory contests.
Please share it with us, Chester.
Yeah, so there are 3 main principles that will always be involved no matter what specific technique a memory champion like myself ends up using. First thing we always keep in mind is try to turn whatever it is that we're trying to remember, whether it's a name, a point from a presentation, try to turn it into something that you can visualize, something you can picture, because we tend to be pretty good at remembering things that we see. From there, we try to involve more senses, additional senses. So then we're lighting up more areas of the brain. We're building more connections in our mind to the information. And third thing we want to keep in mind is while we're doing all of this, we want to make it weird, unusual, extraordinary in some way to take advantage of the psychological aspect to human memory. And that is all of us, without even trying, we tend to remember things easily that catch us by surprise, that are extraordinary, right? If an elephant crashed into the studio right now, you would probably remember that for the rest of your life, always tell that story, and you wouldn't even have to try to commit that to memory, right? So those are the 3 main principles that we will always employ no matter what specific memory technique.
I remember there was a guy at Las Ideas, unfortunately he passed away, Eduard Punset, that I think based on works by Daniel Kahneman, he mentioned many times that, for example, when you go to a trip, you will remember the worst moment of your trip or the most exciting one, and of course the last days. And that's one thing that he said. Another one, of course, it has to do always with emotions, the intensity of the emotion. How true is that? Is that really a hypothesis or it's proven?
Oh, that's totally true. And each of these biases that I was talking about, one of them would be the serial positioning effect, which is what he was referring to. When we're bombarded with information, we're more likely to remember the first thing we heard and the last thing we heard. When we are told something funny, it's more likely to be remembered. All of this has been documented by cognitive scientists in controlled laboratory kinds of settings. What we're doing when we are hacking our memory effectively is taking advantage of those principles. And what's amazing is, these were all discovered by these principles were discovered by cognitive scientists in the 20th century for the most part, but they were known about and used by the ancients. And that to me was the most surprising and incredible thing about my journey. Was I was delving into, the modern scientific literature, but I was also going back in time 2,500 years, 2,000 years to find what the Romans had to say about memory. And they wrote a lot about memory. Why? Because they couldn't necessarily write everything down. They lived in a culture that privileged memory and having a good memory in a way that we don't respect today. And so if you want to know how to remember better, those are the people you need to read. It's the ancients.
That's incredible. I mean, this method about imagine you're in a home, or imagine you're in a castle, or imagine that you're in whatever architectural space, and that you will put, for example, a pen in the living room, and you have to remember and imagine that living room and putting the pen there, and then a chicken in the refrigerator shouting, and then you will go again and you will check all the rooms of the house and you will remember the objects. Something like that. I'm sorry if I make a very simple thing of a very complicated thing that I have read from your books and your work. Are these principles coming from Rome and Greece, or this was like a discovery done much more in the 20th century? I mean, this particular method of putting things and remember things within a spatial dimension.
Yeah, those techniques were invented in ancient Greece and were widely known in the ancient world. In fact, when Cicero wrote his classic book on oratory, on how to give speeches, he says, when you're giving a speech, you should use this technique, the memory palace that you just described. He said, but I don't need to waste any ink telling you how to do it, because for sure you already know or can read about it somewhere else. It was just assumed that if you were a learned, educated person, these were among the things that one knew, because one had to remember. So you had to know the techniques for remembering.
Chester, I remember about your classes that one thing was to remember, actually you made us remember the 15 winners of the Oscars of the last, 20 years. I don't remember. I'm sorry, I tried to remember, but not exactly. But also then it came the part of faces, and then the part of numbers. And I mean, it was a very different method with faces. I'm a person that have a lot of problems to actually have good memory for faces. What's working differently in our brains, and what's the methodology that you could recommend to people to remember the faces of the people that you meet? Chester.
Yeah, so it's a little bit different than the, walking around the house, the journey method or method of loci. That involves a location where you're storing an image, right? You're storing an image that reminds you of what you want to remember at a location. It's similar, the best technique for remembering names, but you're going to store the image. In this case, instead of a location in your mind, you're going to store the image that reminds you of the name on that person whose name you're trying to remember. So the concept is, when you're meeting someone, you ask yourself, what to you is noticeable about their look? So for instance, if you meet a guy named Mike and you think, this particular Mike has really cool looking hair, you might then imagine that his hair is getting tangled around a giant microphone. All right. So the microphone represents the name Mike. So the next time you see this person, all you have to do is ask yourself, what is noticeable to me about his look? What you noticed before is likely what you notice again. You'll see the Mike. That's going to remind you of that his name is Mike.
Okay. Wow. Actually, I read a book, I forgot the name. I'm talking about memory and I forgot everything. That, for example, a lot of people, I think it was Freak Economics, by the way, where people that their names is Lawrence, a lot of them become lawyers or Dennis dentist. I mean, even what you're saying, it's something even about the self-deception that your name helps you to actually choose a profession. There's like a kind of association. I don't know how true is this. Joshua, by any chance, have you read the book Made to Stick?
I've never actually read it, no, sorry.
It's because in that book, the authors talk about a different method named success. That if you want to remember a nice story or a message, you have to make it simple, unexpected, concrete, clear, emotional, and tell a story. How true is that? I mean, that forget about remembering names or numbers on faces. Now I want to really remember narratives, stories, this program, and tomorrow I could talk about what I learned from it. Made to Stick has a method, but I don't know what's your method about it, on how it's different with what I just mentioned.
So that sounds very different from what Chester is talking about, remembering strings of random numbers or playing cards, but it's not different at all. Because what it ultimately comes down to is the same basic principles of memory, which is that our brains were built to remember things that are unexpected, that are funny, that are strange, that are colorful. And when a memory champion is trying to pack all of these memories into their brain, they're applying those principles and concrete and imageable, as you said earlier. That's the secret of giving great presentations. And tell a story. We are storytelling creatures. And to the extent that we can tell stories that take advantage of those cognitive quirks that the memory champions are using, that's really the essence. It's not a coincidence that the early practitioners of these arts of memory, of these arts of memorizing, were orators. They wanted to learn these techniques so they could give better presentations, so they could give better speeches. That's why Cicero, the great Roman orator, was writing about techniques like the memory palace 2,000 years ago. It's the same basic science.
I would like to imagine two scenarios. First, Chester, about the implications. One could be, and we could talk about it, imagine a person that remembers everything. What a world will that be? What will happen to our brains? I'm just talking about fiction, but I think there must be like an evolutionary psychological reason why we remember some things and not other things. But there are some traumas that it's better just to forget them. But I mean, that's a very deep analysis of why you don't remember some things and why you go to therapy probably to try to work with them and to change the story probably. And the second one, which will be a little bit more funnier, and I think Chester could share with us his experience, is, for example, a person that has your ability, Chester, and go to play poker. If I remember correctly, you were a champion for poker or something like that. Are you allowed with your techniques? How it works? Because I mean, I would like to play poker with you, for example, but share with some of the implications of having this great memory that both of you have. We could start with that, and then we could talk about why we forget actually things. Chester.
Yeah, so the first part, imagining someone that automatically remembers everything and they can't stop that from happening, I think that would be a very bad situation because, as you mentioned, I think we probably do forget things, and it's good for mental health. There are certain things we don't want to remember. It's probably better for us to forget those things. In terms of the applications for gambling, for poker, you might be able to gain an advantage in poker. I actually haven't done it, but I have helped poker players prepare for tournaments and things like that by remembering, given these two particular hole cards in Texas Hold'em, for instance, just commit to memory the percentages and how, memorize how is best to act given certain situations. So it's a little bit different. So you would have an advantage if you prepared for poker games with these types of techniques. But what most people, I think, keep in mind or think about when they hear about these techniques is blackjack. But it's actually, blackjack is actually different. Card counting is not the same as memorization. Blackjack is actually more of card counting for blackjack is more of a mathematical process rather than a memory process. But you could give yourself an advantage in poker by learning the percentages for certain hands and things like that.
Joshua.
The great Argentinian writer Jorge Luis Borges wrote a story called Funes the Memorious about a character who remembered everything. And Borges concludes that story by saying that to think is to forget. That actually it is what we don't remember, what we allow not to be imprinted on ourselves, that is the essence of thinking. It's the filtering out what doesn't matter and only retaining the very, very, very small portion of what's flowing through our senses that is important, that is the essence of thought.
It's an amazing book, by the way. We just have 5 minutes, but I mean, I would love that the audience could, besides thinking about memory and this metacognition of memory, we could receive an advice or a very briefly technique from both of the most expert personalities in the world about memory. If they watch our program and 10 minutes after, they learn a small technique just to improve their memories, what would be your advice or the exercise they should practice? Or I know it's a very complicated question because probably you will need more time, but if you could give something, whoever wants to answer.
Well, you gave a kind of a very, very brief overview of what the memory palace is and how it works. And for me, the first time somebody actually showed this to me, it was like a miracle. I did not believe how effective this was the first time somebody showed this to me. And it's so simple. Next time you have a list of anything that you want to remember, okay? All you need to do is take a walk through your house and put images of the things that you want to remember in each room of your house. It doesn't sound like that should work. It doesn't sound like that should be effective. I want you to go home and try it from home, and then test yourself. Walk back through your house.
Could you give us an example?
That those images are just
describe a little bit with an example. Your house, just to.
I've got to remember a shopping list, okay? The first item is milk. I'm going to imagine milk being poured over my head at the front door. Then I'm going to walk in. The next item is tomato sauce. I'm going to picture some giant tomatoes growing inside my house. Then I'm going to go into the kitchen, and the next item is cheese. And I'm going to imagine a mouse, slicing cheese up, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You just walk through your house like that, and those images will be sticky.
Increíble. Chester.
Yeah, I would like people to just visualize what I describe right now. See if they can remember this. Just visualize some gigantic machines, if you can. These giant machines are smashing up a huge pile of gold and silver, rising up out of the gold and silver, a bunch of vehicles, all right? See vehicles rising up, shooting out of the windows of the vehicles. You see a bunch of medicine. Exploding out of the medicine is oil, all right? I'll quickly review. The giant machines were smashing up gold and silver. What rose up, it was vehicles. What came out of the vehicles, it was medicine. What exploded out, it was oil. So you actually just memorize the top 5 exports of the UK. So it's machinery, precious metals, vehicles, pharmaceuticals, and oil. You memorize those exports by building a simple little story. So hopefully people will learn something from that quick exercise.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Well, as I can see, imagination is part of the inputs that you need really to have a good memory. You have to be, I mean, when you could imagine these kind of things, they will be there forever because are things that are outliers, that are not normal. Well, now you could talk a little bit or recommend us. Chester, you have written how many books about memory, mention the names, as well as you, Joshua, and like that we could say, thank you very much, of course, but they will have like much more support and data to work on it. Your books, my dear friend Chester.
Yeah, so I've written a couple of books, Mastering Memory Techniques to Turn Your Brain from a Sieve to a Sponge, and also Instant Memory Training for Success. So they'll help you to learn the techniques and also really how you can specifically apply the techniques to be more successful in your career, personal life, and also to help your kids out in school.
Thank you. Joshua, please, again.
Sure. So after you read Moonwalking with Einstein, of course, I recommend as a next step, The Art of Memory by Francis Yates. It's a book about the history of these memory techniques. And then as a contemporary book, in addition to Chester's wonderful books, there's a relatively new one from Nelson Dellis, who's also a U.S. memory champion. And so there's a growing field of these and lots of practical tips to learn and use.
My dear friends, it's really a pleasure to be with you. It will be an unforgettable moment for me, as always, when I have the chance to chat and learn from you. And hope to see you soon. And thank you very, very much. Tengan muy buenas noches. Muchas gracias. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye.
Señoras y señores, la memoria. ¿Qué recordamos? ¿Cómo impactan las emociones? ¿Cómo podemos platicarnos narrativas, visualizarlas, esconder objetos, nombres en diferentes partes de la proxémica que nos rodea, de los espacios en los que vivimos? Y con base en ello, hacer que lo olvidable sea inolvidable. Joshua Foster, Chester Santos, dos mentes memorables. Gracias, quédese en ADN 40. Un placer estar con ustedes. Nos vemos el próximo domingo de Cabeza.